As we continue our look at the life and ministry of Jesus out of the Gospel of Matthew, there's one thing in the chapter today that I want us to focus on. In Matthew chapter 14, which we're looking at today, there's a lot going on. In the first part, we see that John the Baptist is executed, beheaded by Herod the Tetrarch, really on a whim. And ultimately, it was the will of his wife Herodias that caused that to happen. We see also Jesus with his disciples perform the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And then at the end of the chapter, we see Jesus and Peter for a short time walking on top of the water on a lake. It was quite a day. But it isn't those things that I want to focus on today. What I want us to pay attention to today is Jesus attempting and eventually succeeding at getting away from the crowds and the busyness of ministry and life to be alone with God. There's a series of simple yet, I think, profound books by Jill Murphy which are about the realities of the life of Mr. and Mrs. Large and their young children. Even if you're not familiar with the books, some of the titles of the books might resonate with you. The first of these books is called 5 Minutes of Peace, and it's about the difficulties that a parent has trying to get even 5 minutes of peace and quiet. Spoiler alert, Mrs. Large managed to get 3 minutes and 45 seconds of quiet before the whole family descends on her again. Another book is called A Quiet Night In, and it's about how Mr. and Mrs. Large finally managed to schedule a night in, home alone, to spend some quality time with each other. But then they're so exhausted with the pressures of life and the busyness that they end up just falling asleep. I mention it because it mirrors in some ways Jesus' experience. Here in Matthew 14, Jesus wasn't planning on teaching those crowds and feeding the 5,000. He was in the process of trying to get away, to be quiet and alone with God. But the crowds followed him, and he saw their needs, and he had compassion on them, and he ministered to them. So today I want us to be focusing on the spiritual disciplines of silence and solitude. Now, if I had brought this message a few months back, it probably would have hit different chords in us than the ones that it maybe hits today. A few months ago, we would have been able to connect with this idea of being busy and desperately needing some kind of peace and quiet for 5 minutes. Today, in this season of physical isolation, many of us might be thinking, I've got too much time. I've got too much silence and solitude on my hands. So sometimes silence and solitude is this idea that we dream of in the busyness of life. Other times it can be something that we fear and we dread. For some, silence is uncomfortable. It's nothing. It means nothing is happening, and we live in a world that tells us we should always be doing something. We should always be busy with something. For some people, solitude is frightening. So many people are already very alone, or at least feeling very alone. So I think that even and maybe especially in this time where we are physically disconnected, we're physically disconnected from people, we're disconnected from family, from the normal patterns of our lives, some of us from our work. In this time of isolation, it's important for us to understand what it was that Jesus was doing here, and to understand what kind of rest and work balance Jesus was modeling for us here. So let's begin by looking at the example of Jesus and by reading Matthew chapter 14. I'm going to read verses 1 to 14 and then jump down to verse 22 to 23. Now at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead. This is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It's not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered John a prophet. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guests, and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted, and he had John beheaded in prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Then jumping down to verse 22 to 23. Immediately, this is immediately after the feeding of the 5,000, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone. So this happens immediately after Jesus learns of the beheading of John the Baptist. Now let me ask you this question. How do you think Jesus was feeling in that moment? Maybe hurting and in pain, sad for the loss of his cousin, angry at the injustice of it all, the unfairness, the foolishness of the way John died, concerned for himself and his disciples about the power and the violence of those who opposed him. He might have been physically exhausted. He might have been feeling alone and disconnected with God. I think because of some of these reasons, and maybe others that we haven't thought of, Jesus needed to get away. He needed to be alone. He needed to get away from the noise and the crowds. But of course, as we read, the crowds followed him. And then we have Jesus performing that miracle of feeding them all, as well as healing their sick and their injured. But notice that Jesus didn't let that interruption get in the way of his finding silence and solitude. He dealt with the crowds, and then he continued on with his plan of being alone. But we need to remember that it wasn't simply about an escape from the crowds and from the work. It wasn't just about being alone by himself. There's a quote by Henry Nouwen that talks about silence and solitude. He said, "Solitude and silence can never be separated from the call to unceasing prayer. If solitude were primarily an escape from a busy joy, and silence primarily an escape from a noisy milieu, they could easily become a very self-centered form of asceticism. But solitude and silence are for prayer." The Desert Fathers did not think of solitude as being alone, but as being alone with God. They did not think of silence as not speaking, but as listening to God. Solitude and silence are the context within which prayer is practiced. The purpose of Jesus withdrawing was not simply to be alone, but to be alone with God in prayer. It wasn't just for physical rest, but for spiritual rest. And I want to pick up on this aspect of Jesus' ministry here, because from this chapter forward, from chapter 14 and continuing really for the rest of his ministry, we see Jesus doing this many different times. In the chapters that follow, we see Jesus doing it sometimes with the 12, sometimes just with 3 of his disciples, sometimes by himself. But this becomes a regular pattern of Jesus' ministry. And it's significant to me because if Jesus himself needed this, how much more do you and I need it? If Jesus needed to be intentional about getting away from the busyness, of getting away from the crowds, and being alone with God and praying, how much more do you and I need to be intentional about that in our lives? The second reason I want to focus on this is because in this time of us having less to do in our lives and more time of silence and solitude, let's remember to take that time and spend some of that time with God. That silence and solitude by itself isn't enough. We need silence and solitude with God. Let's not simply let that time slip away by binge watching TV or scrolling social media or sending funny Snapchats. There's nothing necessarily wrong with any of those things, but they aren't going to bring us the kind of spiritual rest and renewal that we need. Let's remember, even in this time of isolation, to isolate ourselves with God and take time for prayer and for rest and refreshment. How do we do that? Let's get practical about that for a few minutes and think about how to make silence and solitude with God a regular part of our lives. Well, I think one thing that we have to do is prioritize. When things get back to normal, whatever that looks like, whatever that means, the first thing that we need to do is realize that time will be an issue. One of the first things that comes up as an excuse for why we're not spending time with God, or we struggle with spending time reading His Word or praying, is that we have trouble finding time in the day. We're busy, and it's hard to find the time. But I think even now, in this place of isolation, of time where our normal patterns are disrupted, and we seem to have more time than we've ever had before, we find ways of filling our days. And we can still make time an excuse. It might be a good exercise for us, even right now, to journal the end of our day. To stop at the end of the day and think about all the things that you did and write them down, and how much time each thing took. As we analyze that list, it might help us to see some things that we put ahead of spending time with God. Things that we intentionally chose to prioritize over spending time alone with God. When I say that to myself as well. I try to make it a regular part of my life to get away for a couple of days, a few times a year, just to spend quiet with God, to be alone. When I do that, I like to go camping, or I like to just get out into nature, to the water somewhere, and just be quiet and pray and listen. I can't do that right now. But I have to ask myself, what can I do? What am I doing? Am I spending too much time watching TV? Am I spending too much time on my phone? It's no problem finding the time usually. But am I making time for quality time with God? Our time alone with God needs to be a priority. The second thing we can do is plan. I don't know about you, but I find that many things in my life, don't happen by accident. They don't happen unless they're planned out. Jesus planned to get away. This was what He was trying to do. He was planning to do it. And even though there was a delay in it, even though the crowds came and there was some interference, He didn't let it stop Him. If we want to practice these disciplines that we're talking about here today, then we need to plan for it. We need to plan not only the time, but also the place. Right now, my quiet time with God happens because I'm the first one up in the house. And I've got a couple of hours of quiet usually before anyone else is up. And so my quiet time is on the couch, in the living room, with the dog, with a cup of coffee, and spending time being quiet and listening to God and praying and reading. That will change when school eventually starts up and I'm back to driving a school bus. So at that point, I'll have to make a new plan. Another thing we need to do is to expect distractions and difficulties. We're easily distracted. Our minds wander. And we start thinking about other things. Our minds maybe go to some of the worries of things that are around the next corner. Sometimes these distractions are from ourselves, but sometimes we can know that they are from the enemy. We can be certain that the enemy, Satan, wants to discourage us and would prefer that we didn't spend time with God, and so he's going to throw things at us to distract us and discourage us. Let's expect those things and decide that we won't be moved by them. And then start small. Silence and solitude are things that will take time to get used to. So don't expect to be able to be a hermit locked away with God for hours on end at a time. Start small. Maybe 5 or 10 minutes is all you can do at the beginning. The important thing is to try. All of this is about spending time with God so that we can improve and deepen our relationship with God. And ultimately, as Jesus modeled for us, these times of solitude and silence alone with God are absolutely essential. Time of silence and being alone with God, they deepen our relationship with Him, they restore our life in Him, and they help us to focus and strengthen us in the work that He's calling us to do with Him.